Thanks, Nick. What I would like to do today is to tell you why I'm addicted to optimization. But I got to begin with an apology. Normally one says, it's a pleasure to be here. I have to say instead, it's not a pleasure not to be here. And in fact, here's my excuse. Long before learning about this honor, my wife and I had planned the 50th anniversary trip abroad, and we just couldn't change that. So again, please accept my apologies for not being here in person, and I hope this video will be a good substitute. I'm very deeply honored to have received the first Khachiyan Prize. I'd very much like to thank the prize committee of Martin Gretschel, Arkady Nemhauser, Panos Pardalos, and Thomas Terlaki. And after I learned from an email from Thomas that I was the recipient, I was curious to know who had nominated me. So I asked Bill Cook, and Bill said, oh, of course, you know, I was part of it. Bill's my colleague at Georgia Tech, and the nomination actually was done by Bill, my former student Gerard Cornigeau, and my very close friend Bill Polivank. I really have lots of people to thank, and I will take a little bit of time to do this, because without help from these people, I could not have had the career that I've had. First of all, my thesis advisor, Jack Mitten. I came to Northwestern as a graduate student in 1958 to get a master's degree in chemical engineering. As part of that, I took a course from Jack in operations research. I had never really heard of operations research before, and Jack was absolutely a wonderful person who's influenced my whole life. When I finished my PhD, I moved on to Johns Hopkins. Ellie Nador was a senior faculty member there. As a young faculty member, it's kind of difficult to know exactly what to do, and Ellie guided me showed me the ropes. And soon after getting to Hopkins, the National Bureau of Standards, now NIST, was doing a transportation project on how to make transportation more efficient in the Northeast Corridor from Washington to Boston. My technical advisor on that project was Alan Goldman. You all, of course, know of his work, and Alan had great influence on me. After about 8 or 9 years at Hopkins, I moved to Cornell, and 2 years after I arrived at Cornell, Ray Fulkerson, everybody knows of Ray, of course, the famous person for network flows. Ray joined the faculty there, and Ray really, I learned a lot from Ray about how to be a real scholar. Oops. Also want to thank all my colleagues who I've worked with in the last several years. I will mention every one of these people a little bit later on in the talk. And what I'm really most proud of is that over my nearly 50-year career at Hopkins, Cornell, and Tech, I have had 58 PhD students. That's a little bit cheating, because in the last couple of years I've co-supervised some of these students with Ellis Johnson and Shabir Ahmed and Martin Salzberg. Actually, I could have put 59 there, because and here's somebody that you all probably know his name. He's been on the cover of Newsweek, Time magazine. Technically, at Hopkins, John Malone, who got his PhD in '67, was a student of Manny Belmore, but I really worked very closely with John. And one thing I can say safely is that John is certainly the richest person who ever got a PhD in operations research. Well, I've had some really wonderful students, and I've learned as much from them as or more than they've learned from me. So, important part of my life. My philosophy about doing research is very simple. I really like to get my ideas from real problems. I like to get exposed to real problems, and whenever you see these problems, there's always some new things come up that haven't come up before, and that's where I like to generate my research. in contrast, I say, to the person who reads papers and sees, oh, this paper leaves out, has left this as an open problem. I don't think that's nearly as fruitful as generating the ideas directly from real problems. I started as a chemical engineer. I got a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering and then went on to Northwestern to get a master's degree. But as I mentioned already, in that first year, I met Jack Mitten. And Jack was also a chemical engineer. And he suggested that a thesis topic to me involving dynamic programming. You know, standard dynamic programming usually involves a set of stages which early on were mostly, the stages correspond to time periods. You can think of that as a directed path in a graph. And so you can think of dynamic programming having been done on directed paths and graphs. When you look at a chemical process with feedback loops and branches, you really need a much more general situation, and you need to do dynamic programming on a pretty general digraph. That's what my thesis was about, how to do that. Interesting little story here at the same time. A very famous applied mathematician at the time by the name of Gus Arras at Minnesota was working on this very same problem. We wrote papers at about the same time, and I got to referee his paper. Well, he was a very famous guy, but his paper was wrong. And so I got into my first conflict of what goes on in research pretty early on, but fortunately it was resolved successfully. And soon thereafter, I wrote a little book on dynamic programming. Integer programming has been the field I've worked on in all these last many years. And here's how it got started. I heard a talk by an early person in operations research by the name of Sid Hess. And Sid came to Hopkins to give a seminar and talked about some pro bono work he was doing on school districting. Well, and he said, would you like to work on this kind of problem? And at the time, it was really, political districting was really exciting. The Supreme Court had just passed its one man, one vote law. And many of the states, particularly those in the South, were incredibly far from achieving that. In Georgia, for example, there were congressmen who represented 15,000 people, and another congressman who represented 600,000 people. And so the Supreme Court said all these districts had to be redrawn, and this was a natural integer programming problem to be set up as a set partitioning model with columns being incidence vectors of districts, and the cost of a column could relate, for example, to how far it was from being a perfect district with regard to population. I got my student Bob Garfinkel involved in this problem, and we developed an implicit enumeration algorithm, no linear programming, for solving this problem. Got us, both of us, really interested in integer programming, and in the early 70s we wrote an integer programming book. My first NSF, soon after that I left Johns Hopkins and moved to Cornell, and really got involved in integer programming research. My first NSF grant was on packing, partitioning, and covering problems, and here we began seriously to use structure to solve integer programming problems with branch and bound algorithms that use linear programming. We knew we had to tighten the linear programming relaxations. That led to customized cuts involving things like cliques and lifted aught holes. And we got, and this work was done with my student Les Trotter. This was his thesis, and we got a very nice little theorem which seems to only apply to this problem. When you solve a linear programming relaxation of a node packing problem with just the edge constraints, all the variables that are 0, 1 in the relaxation can be fixed at those values. While we were working on this, Ray Fulkerson joined our faculty, and he came up with this family of integer programs, and he said, George, I don't really do computation integer programming, but here's a really hard problem that you can't solve. And he gave us these Steiner triple system problems, which have still persist as extremely difficult problems to solve today. Marshall Fisher was a visitor at Cornell in the mid-70s, and he came along with a very nice problem that involved maximizing float. In those days, the number of days it took to clear a check written from one bank, paid to another bank, depended upon how far they were apart. And so, for example, if someone paid you a check written on a bank in San Francisco and your bank was in New York, it might take 3 or 4 days to clear. Well, the big brokerage houses like Merrill Lynch at the time realized that they could keep their money a little longer by paying their clients in New York from banks on the West Coast and vice versa. And the question, but you can't locate too many banks. The question was, you don't want to have too many accounts, so the question was where to locate them. This became a classic facility location problem. Marshall and I got Gerard Cornijos, who was another PhD student of mine, as jointly to work on this stuff. And we got some of the very early results on approximation algorithms using LP duality. At that point, I moved to Belgium to Center for Operations Research and Econometrics for a couple of years. I was there as their research director, began working seriously with Lawrence Wolsey. We extended the facility location work to maximizing submodular functions. And Gerard had his PhD thesis on this topic, and the original paper received the Lanchester Prize then from ORSA, of course now Informs. Continued to work very heavily on integer programming throughout the 80s. During a good part of this time, I was chair of the IEOR department at Cornell, and so had a little bit less time for research, but really pushed forward on writing integer programming and combinatorial optimization with Lawrence Wolsey, for which we also received the Lanchester Prize. At the time, I was intrigued by Kvatel's interpretation of Gomri cuts. The idea that you could get Gomri cuts simply by rounding. And so in writing the book, Lawrence and I said, well, what's the similar interpretation for mixed integer programs? And we invented this idea of mixed integer rounding, which has become a very important way, I think, of generating cuts for mixed integer programming problems, and has continued to be used today. And more I got involved in computational integer programming. It was difficult to really do computational research because the codes that were out there didn't let you play with pieces of the code. And so we had the idea of we need to build a research code for integer programming, one where you could really get into the guts of the code and change the branching rules, change your cutting plane strategies, whatever you wanted to do. And so I started this project with a student called Gabriel Sigismondi, and at the same time Martin Salvesberg was at Georgia Tech. I'd come to Georgia Tech by this time. Salvesberg was a postdoc at Georgia Tech, and the Minto code was created. A graduate student at the time was Zhanghao Gu, and he also helped write this code. And of course, he's the Gu. He got his PhD at Georgia Tech, and he's the Gu of Gurobi, that you all now know, and also was very influential in writing the Cplex IP code, which had its early roots from Minto. In the late 80s, Ellis Johnson joined our faculty at Georgia Tech, and Ellis had been working on airline problems. Well, one nice thing about being in Atlanta is we had Delta in the backyard, and an even nicer thing was the CEO of Delta at the time was an ISYE graduate, and so we were able to get into Delta. Delta at the time was using that crazy AT&T car marker code to do its crew optimization. That was, that code didn't even have an IP solver, a real IP solver in it. And so we got very involved with Delta, and then also with American Airlines and United, Northwest, and began to do serious research on new models, new solution techniques for crew scheduling, fleet scheduling. Disruptions became I think we did some of the very early work on disruptions, and were able to analyze such solutions with a simulation model we built of airline operations. This work was done with Cindy Barnhart had joined our faculty then, and she worked with us on this stuff. And on the simulation stuff, Anton Kleiwek participated, along with many graduate students. Well, the work on airline crew scheduling led us immediately to think more about how do we solve integer programs with a huge number of columns. And that led us to the notion of, well, we named it Branch and Price. Other people had been doing similar stuff, for example, the group in Montreal. This kind of approach to integer programs also proved fruitful in sports scheduling problems. I was for some time Georgia Tech's faculty representative to the ACC and the NCAA, and I heard about they were having a difficult time doing their sports scheduling as TV began to, the ESPN and so on began to press harder for getting the games to the times they wanted them. And so I heard that Mike Trick, former Georgia Tech PhD, who was now at Carnegie Mellon, was doing some work with Major League Baseball. We got into contact. Kelly Easton, PhD student at Georgia Tech, wrote her thesis on this topic, and this eventually led to a little company. We now have the sports scheduling group, and we schedule Major League Baseball, among others. Well, the work on computational interprogramming has continued to the present. Most recently, I've been thinking about how to deal with problems of uncertainty in interprogramming, and together with my colleague Shabir Ahmed and students, we've been working on polyhedral approaches to stochastic interprogramming. Even more, I still love to work on applied problems, and one of the most fascinating ones I've worked on in the last few years, an idea that probably was before its day because the company is no longer in operation, but on-demand air transportation where you've got to solve integer programs. You change your schedule on the fly with each reservation, you've got to solve integer programs enormously quickly, and we built scheduling software, scheduling algorithms and software for DayJet. More recently, working heavily with ExxonMobil in inventory routing, and another computational problem I like very much is I still don't think we know how to branch in integer programming, so we're trying to work on learning methods, or artificial intelligence learning methods for doing that. Okay, let me just close quickly with what I had on the last slide really mimics what I think we don't know how to do, because that's what, and that includes real-time integer programming. You might have to solve a series of problems all very close to each other that differ slightly, but they got to be solved in 10 seconds. How do you use solutions that you currently have to get new solutions? Uncertainty in integer programming is extremely difficult. There's some very nice work on robust optimization, of course, by Nemhauser and Bental and Bertsimis, but what about the chance-constrained integer programming, stochastic integer programming? Those are still open questions, as is extending much of the work we've done in linear integer programming to nonlinear integer programming. Well, I'd like to thank you all for attending this talk, and again apologize for not being here, but I welcome questions and comments. Just send me an email. You got my email address right there. Thanks again.